Again. Hello everyone, welcome to another session of the Institute on the Impossible online talks. It's my pleasure to have Carrie Jenkins here. Carrie's gonna ask why there can be numbers. So Carrie, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to start by just sharing my slides here. While that is hopefully setting itself up. Um, Thanks so much, Martin, for hosting and for this invitation. Really excited to be a part of this series. I've been enjoying lots of the talks so far. I wanted to actually, I'm not so much asking why there can be numbers as explaining why there can be numbers. So I have no question mark for my title. Um, and I'm mostly doing this in reaction to some recent work by David Builes, who's been trying to argue that there can't be numbers. And I'll sort of talk about his reasons for saying they can't and my doubts about his reasons. But then I also want to hopefully get a bit beyond just that sort of back and forth between myself and David and get into some of the sort of context, which I think is, you know, really what I like about the Builes paper is that it is bringing to bear a bundle of concepts and moves in metaphysics more generally that the philosophy of math and the metaphysics of math can really benefit from engaging with. So that's the kind of 2 second summary of what I'm up to. Here's the slightly longer summary. I've really leaned into the Halloween theme with my slides. So I'm going to be talking about. Here's David Builes. He's not very scary. I tried to make him look like a sort of a ghost or something, but he's actually not a very scary fellow. He's very friendly chap. I had the pleasure of meeting him recently. He came to UBC to talk about something else, but yes, not scary at all. Nevertheless, I've tried to give him a ghostly appearance. So he has a paper forthcoming in Philosophical Quarterly, arguing against the position that he's referring to as mathematical Platonism. I'll come back and define lots of the important pieces of terminology in a moment. And his argument is really quite simple. It's just a nice, two premises and a conclusion type argument. So the first premise, necessarily there are no bare particulars. Second premise, necessarily, if there are abstract mathematical objects, then there are bare particulars. And obvious conclusion, therefore, necessarily there are no abstract mathematical objects. I think this argument has multiple issues. I will survey a few of them, hopefully fairly briefly. And I want to focus on a big issue that I have with premise two, which is the purported connection between the existence of abstract mathematical objects and their particulars. There's an assumption behind Builes's claim here, which he does argue for, and we'll get into his arguments. Maybe calling it an assumption is slightly unfair because it sounds like he's not going to give any. But the pre-premise is that any intrinsic property an abstract mathematical object can instantiate is merely negative or otherwise non-sparse. I'll come back to this terminology as well. But the important part of it is that bearing such a property does not suffice to make a particular non-bear. Okay, so that's going to be a really important piece of this. I will then argue that Builes is neglecting the structural properties of structures in arguing for premise two of his argument, and that undermines the thrust of what he's up to here. But I will say still, this shines light on important underexplored questions in the metaphysics of mathematics. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be doing. Here's some of my ominous terminology. Okay, so mathematical objects Builes is going to um, focus mostly on numbers, but he intends for his thesis to cover all of the kinds of mathematical objects that Platonists about mathematics believe in, typically. So that would include things like sets, functions, whatever else you think the mathematical objects might be. And later he'll talk about structuralism, so he will come to include structures within that purview. He's targeting the view that believes in these objects as abstracta, so non-causal, not physical, and also not spatiotemporally located. Uh, Set aside worries about whether some abstract objects might be spatiotemporally located. He's interested in the view of mathematical objects where they aren't. Okay, so Platonism, he's just using as a word to mean the view that abstract mathematical objects exist, and he'll use nominalism for the contrary view, the contradictory view that abstract mathematical objects do not exist. He's using a bare particular, he's using the phrase bare particular to mean an object with no sparse intrinsic properties. I have more to say about that. But for now, I'll just say, that what he means by sparse is somewhat open-ended, explicitly so in the paper. So the broad general idea is that there's a distinction between kinds of properties where the so-called abundant properties can be just about anything. They are cheap, so they might be negative, they might be super disjunctive, they might be gruesome, all of that kind of thing. But the sparse properties are a special reserved set of properties that have more to them in some sense to be further cashed out. And so Builes allows that this more to them could be cashed out in various ways, and his argument should still go through. So, for example, you might think that the abundant properties are not all real, but the sparse properties are real, right? So the difference is just reality. Or you might think something vaguely Lewisian, like that the sparse properties are the natural properties, or maybe the perfectly natural properties, and the abundant properties could be super unnatural, if you like. Um, there's really no particular view on this that he recommends. He just says that sparse properties have to be somehow metaphysically special. Okay, so bare particulars might have abundant properties. That's the important moving part here, including negative properties. The basic idea of a bare particular, as we'll see in a minute, is a particular that doesn't have any properties. But then that has to be cashed out a little bit more carefully in order for Builes's argument to work. Okay, so old reasons to exorcise the abstract mathematical objects from your ontology. These are reviewed in Builes's paper. I think he does a good job of sort of capturing the gist of what's going on here. So I'm not in massive disagreement with him about any of the layout, but I'm going to sort of walk through it so we can see how he fits in. Okay, epistemic woes. How could we know about abstract mathematical objects? I personally have opinions about that, but that's by the by. I know a lot of people are very worried about this. Parsimony. Why would we want to believe in this infinity, probably, of abstract objects if we don't need to? And then there's a bundle of concerns about uniqueness, which are a little bit more recherche because they're a bit specific to ways of understanding what the abstract mathematical objects are. And most of these are located, at least in terms of their historical origins, in the idea that all mathematical objects are or are reducible to set theoretic objects. And the worry basically here is that there are lots of different ways you could reduce, say, the natural numbers to sets. Um, and so if you think the natural numbers just are some bundle of sets, you're going to have to worry about which one of them is the number 13. Um, that has been an issue of concern. That's one way of spelling out what the worry is. That there are others, but they're not the things I'm going to kind of take issue with here, and they're not part of they're not an important part of Builes's paper. So I'm just going to leave them at that level of vagueness. So all of these worries are out there, and they're not good enough, Builes says, partly because they don't do enough modal work. They don't account for the necessity of nominalism. They might at best show you why, we shouldn't believe abstract objects actually exist, or just why we shouldn't believe that they exist. But they don't show you why they can't. Uh, and the second problem is he says they do nothing to explain why nominalism is true. This is a quote now from Builes. He says they only point to certain theoretical vices that might befall the Platonist. Uh, so, side note, I'm not sure that's a really useful way of putting this. I'm not sure all of those things are well described as theoretical vices, but this is really a quibble. Parsimony might well be, issues with parsimony might amount to a kind of theoretical bias. But I'm not sure if just like failing to be epistemologically reasonable is a theoretical bias so much as just a different kind of objection. But the broad point that is bugging Builes is that he sort of wants this kind of positive support for nominalism, not just um, a series of objections to things that happen if you're not a nominalist. Okay. My side note, second side note is just so what, right? I mean, if you've shown what's wrong with the contrary view, haven't you done some kind of explaining of why nominalism has to be correct? At least it has to in the epistemic sense of has to be correct. Um, I'm not sure. Uh, we'll come back to this thought later because I'm not really convinced that what Builes offers in this paper uh, fares any better along these lines. I think he's pointing to another kind of problem with the Platonist view, namely that he's going to say that Platonists are committed to bare particulars, which looks like it's very similar to the kinds of worries that he's already that he's acknowledging are already out there, at least in this respect. Um, but there is this modal question that he's interested in, as well as the sort of positiveness of the argument that he's looking for. So he does want something that shows why there necessarily can't be abstract mathematical objects, and so he's going to use the sort of the idea that metaphysical claims like there are no bare particulars tend to come with modal strength or intuitively come with modal strength to support his claim that nominalism is necessarily true and not just true as a matter of fact. Um, Underlying all of this, so in the background, and this is another of the old reasons really to be a nominalist, is this intuition that the abstract mathematical objects are, quote, spooky or mysterious. There's something just kind of weird about them. And Builes is really taking that intuition to motivate premise two of his argument, and actually the whole project here. So he's really taking this to be a cashing out or a spelling out or a precisification of that intuition. So just coming back again to what Builes's argument is. So he says his goal is a new argument for the necessity of nominalism that will precify the widespread intuition that mathematical objects are somehow spooky or mysterious. So this is his new reason to be a nominalist. So he's got this sort of two parts to his goal: explain the necessity of nominalism, precify that intuition, and I think that is what's meant to address the explanatory deficits in the old argument, right? That precisification of the intuition, that there's some spookiness or mysteriousness to the abstract mathematical objects. As I said, I don't see how this becomes more positive than the worry that they're unknowable or something like that, but set that aside for now. Okay, so here's the argument, or rather, here are its two premises again. Necessarily, there are no bare particulars. Necessarily, if there are abstract mathematical objects, then there are bare particulars. Okay, so Builes says each of these premises is, quotes, at least prima facie plausible. I will actually have things to say about even that. And then he says that both of them can be supported by philosophical views that are independent of the debate between Platonists and nominalists. Um, and I definitely have things to say about this, several. But what's kind of cool and interesting about it is that he is looking in those places that are independent of this debate for machinery to use here. Okay. So these are his two claims about his two premises, and I'm going to start with the first one. So necessarily, there are no bare particulars. And this one, so here's the, I think this is meant to be a cashing out of the way that these are, like, this one is quotes prima facie plausible. This one, he says, is motivated by, quotes, very general metaphysical considerations concerning the relationship between objects and properties. Okay. And for the second premise, necessarily if there are abstract mathematical objects, then there are bare particulars. He says this one is, and this is quite important, is motivated by the, quotes, increasingly popular structuralist approach to the philosophy of mathematics. So he's, and I want to emphasize this because I am a structuralist too, but he's the one who brings structuralism into this argument, not me. And so that's important rhetorically because the moves I'm going to make later do come from a structuralist place. But that's because structuralist Platonism is specifically the kind he is interested in targeting with his argument. And he thinks, and I think reasonably, that that's the one to go after because it is the most promising, plausible, and popular. And I think that's right. I think it is. Okay. So, all right, what's wrong with bare particulars? So why should we accept premise one? What are the bare particulars going to do to us if we allow them into our ontology? Are they some kind of living dead zombie objects that are going to eat us alive? Well, so Builes sort of briefly surveys a few of the people who've said things about why bare particulars are so terrible. So here's Galen Strawson, for example. Clearly, there can no more be objects without properties than there can be closed plane rectilinear figures that have three angles without having three sides. To be is necessarily to be somehow or other, i.e., to have some nature or other, i.e., to have properties. So these claims are addressed to the idea of bare particulars as objects with no properties at all. And the same is actually true of the second kind of motivation that Builes marshals, which comes from other views in metaphysics, like bundle theoretic views. So bundle theory is basically just going to say that what an object is a bundle of properties. So those kinds of views do not allow for propertyless objects, of course, because an object just is a bundle of properties, got to have some properties. But actually, even that claim we'll come back to because of Ed Zolta. But he rightly says that something like a bundle theory can, of course, be motivated independently of any view about mathematics, including mathematical nominalism. So, he's rightly noticing that if there is support for his premise here, it comes from a much broader metaphysical place. But importantly, in all of these kinds of motivations, which are very intuitive sounding and do indeed sort of get you in the mood to think bare particulars are scary, there is no mention of sparseness, right? There's no mention of the need for these properties that objects must have to be special ones, i.e. sparse ones. So where did it go? Actually, there are a few points in Builes's paper where this sparseness condition for bareness just seems to kind of get lost a bit. Um, so I think this is um, there's a slippage between what's intuitively motivated concerning bare particulars and the premise that Builes really needs to motivate. I feel the force of things like Strawson intuition. Uh, I don't think it will get us where we need to go. But uh, let's talk about why. Okay. So in order to do that, we need to understand what sparseness is supposed to be. And as I mentioned earlier, Builes is not very specific on this on purpose because he wants to keep people on the bus for his argument moving forward. He says it could be cashed out by something like uh, the existence of universals, right? Maybe the abundant properties are mere shadows of language or whatever, but the sparse ones correspond to universals that exist. Maybe it's perfect naturalness, as I mentioned before. Maybe it's a matter of being a real property as opposed to the shadow of a predicate. And then in a footnote, Bueles says this: those philosophers who follow Goodman 1955 in thinking that any such distinction among abundant properties, so any attempt to sort of set aside a special group as the sparse ones, is a mere projection of our conceptual scheme, will be unable to make sense of the notion of a bare particular. Uh, not a bare particular in the minimal sense of a propertyless object, but one in Builes's sense of an object with no sparse properties. This is really important, and I don't think it belongs in a footnote because actually, if we can't make sense of the distinction between sparse and abundant properties for any reason, right, not just Goodman's reason, you don't have to think that that distinction is a projection of our conceptual scheme. You might think, as I do, that you just don't understand at all what the distinction is even supposed to be or how we would make these kinds of calls between a supposedly sparse or abundant property. Then we can't make sense of Builes's argument. He needs us to agree that there is a distinction between sparse and abundant properties in order to agree that there is a notion of bare particular that works the way he thinks it does. And so we can't make sense of it either on its own terms or as a rendering of that old nominalist intuition about spookiness, unless we're prepared to say, well, that intuition was a confusion based on thinking there was a difference between sparse and abundant properties when really there isn't. And of course, he doesn't want us to say that. Okay, so those are some of my multiple issues. Now I want to kind of focus on what I think is the most important, excuse me, for me, the most important issue with the argument, which concerns premise number 2. And premise number 2, remember, is the one linking abstract mathematical objects to bare particulars. Now, why would you think premise 2 is true, given that numbers actually do have properties, right? 4 is self-identical, 13 is my favorite number, etc. These, Builes will say, these are abundant. Now, among the moves you have to make in order to say this are all relational properties are abundant. So remember, he wanted to say only intrinsic ones are allowed to be sparse. Many questions about that claim. Let's set them aside. You also have to say there's something wrong with self-identity as a sparse property, which you might say something like that on the grounds that it doesn't distinguish between one object and any other object, which is true if you also don't like hexaeides, and some people do. But I mean, all of these are worries that I'm just going to say, look, fine. For now, let's allow it. Those ones are abundant and don't count. What about the more substantive sounding properties, like 4 is even, 13 is prime, etc. Those ones, Builes will say for structuralist reasons are also non-sparse. So this is where he is being a structuralist about this. Okay, so to get there, let's step through what structuralism is, or what he takes structuralism to be anyway. He says structuralism is the view that mathematics is the study of purely structural or relational features of things. Okay, I kind of agree. That sounds about right. Here's a classic structuralist position. This is Stuart Shapiro back in 97. Saying there is, quotes, no more to the individual numbers in themselves than the relations they bear to each other. Okay, cool. Shapiro is actually an anti-REM structuralist. And this is important too, because Builes is acknowledging that and allowing the anti-REM position as the, or at least one of the most promising Platonist views out there. Anti-REM structuralism, sorry, just to expand on that thought a little bit more before I go on. Anti-REM structuralism is the view, Shapiro's view, that the structures, let's say the structure of the integers, those structures exist independently, metaphysically independently of, and metaphysically prior to the things in the structures, the nodes, like, an individual natural number. Okay, that's the anti-REM part of anti-REM structuralism. So question, are the anti-REM structuralists' particulars bare in Builes's sense? Okay, that's where our warning lights are supposed to go off for us. That's where Builes wants us to be worried. Okay, so those properties like being prime or being even, the anti-REM structuralists' numbers have those properties, but they are relational properties and therefore not intrinsic. Okay, so they are properties like only being divisible by certain other numbers, or having a certain kind of factor. Those are, or the relational properties like being the successor of. Those are the properties that characterize the natural number structure, and they are all relational according to the structuralist. Therefore, they're not intrinsic. Therefore, what Builes is like, they're not sparse, and they can't make these numbers anything other than bare particulars. Okay. Again, many, many things to say. For now, let's just allow it. What we're going to say next is, well, maybe they have, and Builes is, we're just following Builes here. He anticipates all these claims, right? Maybe they have intrinsic properties like, say, being abstract, right? That's not a matter of their relations to other numbers. But these are, says Builes, negative properties. Okay, so abstract in particular is a negative property because it is or holds in virtue of being non-physical. Sorry for taking that away. I still need that. Being non-physical, being non-causal, being non-spatio-temporal, etc. Okay. And negative properties, like relational properties, are not allowed to count as sparse by Builes's lights. And okay, so putting pieces back together here, Builes says, quote, making sense of the notion of a bare particular requires a metaphysical distinction among intrinsic properties, which rules out the merely negative intrinsic properties such as being non-red. So, like, a side note, remind me why I want to make sense of this notion. I don't think I do, but let's suppose I am. What if being abstract is a non-negative sparse property? What if it's a non-negative intrinsic property and therefore a candidate for sparseness? Now, there's a few ways you could argue this point, right? You could try saying it's a sui generis property. Right? It comes with being non-physical and non-causal and all of that, but it doesn't reduce to those things. It's its own thing. Maybe. Um, Alternatively, you could try saying, what if some negative properties are sparse? Lots of the arguments that Builes surveys for thinking that negative properties have to be abundant look like he's kind of drawing in intuitions about certain kinds of negative properties and then generalizing. So maybe, not being Carrie's favorite number or not being red, let's suppose those sound like, okay, those sound a bit abundant. But do we really therefore want to say that being abstract is not abundant just because those ones are non abundant? Sorry, do we want to say that being abstract is sparse just because, no, abundant just because those ones are abundant? Get my negations in a row here. And also, just to come back to Ed Zalta, who we heard from in this series last talk. If Zalta is right that there are ways of characterizing abstract objects that that talk instead of about their what they don't have, they talk about what they do have, but not necessarily about what properties they instantiate, right? We're also allowed to talk about what properties they, in his terminology, encode. Then that can give us positive ways of characterizing these objects as well, and maybe positive ways of characterizing what their abstractness is or what their other qualities are. Of course, all of that depends on whether you like things that Zolter is saying, and also how you interpret his formalism. And um, he is not he is personally not metaphysically committed on questions about this, but you could use it in ways which are. And so, this does depend on a lot of other moving parts, but of course, so does the kind of move Builes is making, where he's relying on things like, maybe you're a bundle theorist. Okay, maybe you are, but also maybe you're encoding theorist about characterizations of abstract mathematical objects. Okay, so I'm feeling no score draw here still so far. But here's the big piece that I think has gone missing in Builes' argument. It's the structures, right? The structures have disappeared. And because we are talking about structuralism, and particularly because we're talking about anti-REM structuralism, this matters. Okay, what about the structures themselves? Shapiro, for example, says that structures are, he says they have this kind of dual nature. There are structural universals, so they exist as universals, but they also are particulars, right? The structure of the integers, for example, is a thing, is a particular. And if it's not an abstract one, I don't know what is. And if it's not a mathematical one, I don't know what is. So I think the structure of the integers by the anti-REM structure of Slight is an abstract mathematical object. The structure has structural properties, right, that are intrinsic to it. Although they are a matter of relations between the nodes in the structure, and that means that, yes, you could say they're not intrinsic to any node, they are intrinsic to the structure considered holistically. So things like being infinite or having a specific cardinality of Aleph-0, satisfying the Peano axioms, right? These are all intrinsic, I want to say, intrinsic, non-negative, pretty sparse-looking properties of the structure. They aren't intrinsic to any individual node because that's the wrong place to look for the structural properties of a structure. So these matter because these are what Shapiro says mathematics studies, right? So they are, if you're Shapiro-style structuralists, they ought to be the first thing you would consider as a mathematical object. Okay, so I think they can be sparse. I don't yet see any reason to doubt that they are sparse. Even when I, try, I don't actually like the sparse abundant distinction. I don't understand it. But when I try to get myself in the mindset of people who do, I don't know what they could say about these properties that makes them look second rate. They're not merely negative, but I think they have as good a claim as any to be perfectly natural. Um, so the only kind of worry I could think in response to this response, the only kind of worry I could think of was along these kind of lines. Well, maybe committing to those structures will still commit us to bare particulars, like the integers themselves, because once you believe in the structure, you have to then believe in the nodes on the structure. Okay. So one option here is to say no, it doesn't. So you lean into the anti-remness of anti-rem structuralism and say the structures exist metaphysically independently of any instantiation, including instantiation by abstract nodes. Um, the structure still gets to be an abstract mathematical object on this view. Does it two questions now I have about that. Does it become itself a spooky, scary, abstract mathematical object? Maybe, right? This is the ghost of the old intuition behind premise two. But if so, it's not for reasons that are illuminated by Builes's arguments, because we haven't yet cashed this out in terms of anything existing as a bare property in his scary sense. So I think the worry has to be that if you don't like that way of responding, or if just independently you want to rescue the numbers themselves as objects and not just the structure as a considered as a holistic thing, then you have to worry about those numbers being bare in Wheeler's sense. Um, so one more kind of little move here could turn to a philosophy of language maneuver and say the existence of the structure is enough to warrant us saying things like there are numbers without that claim being ontologically committal in a heavyweight sense, right? Maybe it's okay to talk like this because the structure exists, and we don't need to admit the individual numbers into our ontology. But even if we don't like that kind of move, and I don't love that, like I would prefer to keep the numbers around myself if possible. Um, I keep coming back to this question of, okay, so then what is it? Where are we now in terms of what's so scary about these numbers? And so Bueller sort of wraps up his argument by saying this. Those who deny the second premise, okay, so if we deny that uh, necessarily believing in abstract mathematical necessarily if abstract mathematical objects exist, then their particulars exist. If we deny that, we must either reject all structuralist approaches to mathematics in a fairly extreme way, and I think that's not true for the reasons I've just elucidated, or countenance the existence of, and so now I'm supposing I'm on the other horn here, I'm countenance the existence of ineffable and unknowable intrinsic qualities of mathematical objects that are not studied by any field of inquiry. And these are going to be the ineffable and unknowable intrinsic qualities like being abstract, that are not studied by mathematicians per se, let's grant. And so my final kind of move here is to say, well, uh, even this is actually a fairly comfy place to land. So um, if you don't like being on the other horn of the dilemma with the anti-REM structuralist and rejection of the actual numbers as individual objects, then you're forced into this place of saying if the number two does have some intrinsic, because again, a quote from Builes, if the number two does have some intrinsic quality, it follows that it must have an intrinsic quality that isn't investigated by any field of inquiry at all, mathematical or otherwise. But I think it is investigated by a field of inquiry, and I think it's the field known as metaphysics. So I think, there's something that's gone missing here in thinking that these numbers are scary, spooky, inaccessible, unaddressed, unconsidered, is metaphysics, right? Metaphysics is it's here for us. It is actually doing that work. And I think Builes is probably responsive to something and feeling like nobody is asking these questions because not enough metaphysicians are asking these questions. And in this way, right, where we are deploying the best and most current versions of our full metaphysical toolkit in service of debating mathematical Platonism. I think he's right to feel, and I feel it too, that these questions have gotten a bit neglected for the last, I don't know, 10, 20 or so years. Shapiro's book is very old now by, the contemporary metaphysics standards. We have a lot more things we can say since 1997. And you would hope so, right? Because we've been paying lots of people lots of money to do this great work. So, and I think it is great work, and I do think we have a lot more we can do in this area. Um, but I do think it's just unfair to say that abstractness is something that isn't studied by any field of inquiry, because it is. Okay, so what is still lurking as an overarching problem here is something that I think Builes and I would probably agree on. That there's this massive underexplored question. What does structuralism like this really imply about the metaphysics of mathematical objects? How are we to bring our best metaphysical game to that question? Builes is absolutely right to say things like, as he does, the notion of it, the very idea of like applying the idea of bare particulars here is new, right? This is in his words, a technical notion from the metaphysical literature on objects and properties that is seldom discussed in the literature on the philosophy of mathematics. Yes, spot on, true, good point. And so my general moral is there should be more of this, more metaphysics geeks geeking out over the metaphysics of mathematics. That's the Halloween candy at the end of my talk. So thank you all for listening. And this is still fairly new work. You are the second audience to hear this after a very quick trial run within my home department. So please give me any and all kinds of feedback. Thanks very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Carrie. We've got some time for questions, comments. If you have a question, just please raise your hand or just put the emoji. I see Daniel, please. Turn on your microphone, please.
There we go.
Yes.
Yep, working? Great. So I wanted to ask about the direction we go where we say there's the structures have intrinsic properties, so they're not bare particulars, but we leave open that maybe the nodes don't thereby have any sparse intrinsic properties. And it sounded like that was just conceding that this view is committed to bare particulars like the number two and the number seven. And even if we go on and say, well, the philosophy of language thing, now we can concede that and it can mean something lightweight. If Builes is right that there aren't any bare particulars, there aren't any bare particulars when you say that in a lightweight way either. So I was that option of sort of structures first and it has intrinsic properties, that seemed to be a way of denying premise one, but I wasn't clear whether you were thinking about it that way. So I'd love to hear about the dialectic there.
Yeah, thanks. This is helpful. Actually, I particularly like that way of putting there aren't any bare particulars in a lightweight sense either. Because I think you're right. A lot of those kinds of intuitions that he's pumping will work when we're talking lightweight and outside of the seminar room as well. So I'm just writing that down. So good. So this path really targets Builes's claim that any abstract mathematical objects will commit you to bare particulars. So he makes this really very big universally quantified claim that it doesn't matter what kind of Platonist you are. If you believe in abstract mathematical objects, you have bare particulars. And this kind of anti-rem structuralism does not, if they're willing to say that the numbers don't exist. Right, so they say my structure exists and the numbers don't, and that's cool. So I don't care for that little, like, the fill language tricksy thing. I don't like lightweight quantifiers, but I throw it in there just because some people do and they may go that way. But I'm on the other side of this. So the options that I have left personally are that one, which I'm never quite sure if that's like Shapiro or not. Like when he says things like there's no more to the individual numbers than they're in this structure, kind of suggests he might be there, but then he does also seem to say the numbers, a number like 13 exists. So, but this is why we have to press the question, right? This is the sort of thrashing out that I think these issues need. So option number one is the structure exists, but the nodes do not. And then option number two is just to go back to these are not weird. They're not they're not bare in any sense that raises the kinds of problems that Builes thinks get raised. And I tried like all these different ways of cashing out what that problem is. Like lots of them I kind of showed as worries at the beginning. And the last one that he raises at the end is like no field of inquiry studies these. And that's my kind of like, well, metaphysics studies these. And I'm fine with that, right? I am fine with metaphysics as a field of inquiry. So I don't worry about that either. But it is a slightly different move from the kind of main point I want to make, which is that you can't make that universally quantified claim because the structures are themselves abstract mathematical objects and not shown to be bare by any of this.
Yeah, that seems right.
Yeah.
It also seems to me you didn't have to be that concessive about the no other field of inquiry, because if those weird bare thingies are the numbers, we have this thing, mathematics or even number
Yeah.
theory. I wouldn't concede too quickly that number theory doesn't study the numbers unless they turn out to be exactly the kind of thing David wants them to be.
Yeah. So I like at that point, yes, and you might think like actually a lot of fields of inquiry look into this kind of property, not just metaphysics is like the kind of cute one to mention, but anyone who's kind of doing something serious that involves numbers and number theories, number theory is plausibly also involved in this inquiry. What I imagine Builes is saying in response to that, trying to like channel him here, is that the kinds of study they do are not the right kind. So when they what they do is study the relational properties, right? So they are not studying any of those kind of weird, intrinsic, non-negative properties that the objects are supposed to have, which I think there's some plausibility to that. Like, okay, like, disciplinary boundaries do tend to put that stuff in the philosopher agenda and not the mathematician agenda, but it depends which mathematician you talk to. And like some of them are actually also thinking about that. Maybe they have to take off their mathematician hats to do it and put on their metaphysician hats, but they do it. So yeah, even if you're thinking and I think that the reason I think that's what he would say is because when he's talking about that at the end, he does talk about the thing that no field of inquiry looks at being a kind of property, the mysterious ineffable properties or whatever. Hang on, let me look up the actual phrasing. If the number two does have some intrinsic quality, it follows that it must have an intrinsic quality that isn't investigated by any field of inquiry at all, mathematical or otherwise. So it's at that point that he goes after the quality, the property in particular, and I think that's to avoid that response that of course the mathematicians are studying the numbers. It's like yes, but only their normal math properties, not their weird metaphysics properties. But thanks, this is all super helpful.
Okay, do we have more questions?
When I ran this for the UBC folks, they actually mentioned that that move where I point out that the structures survive all of his criticisms is really what it's showing is that his initial arguments were much too general. He does have something kind of interesting here, but he really needed to sort of like qualify it and be very clear about what it is. And I think that might be a nice way of sort of understanding this too. Not that he's not made an interesting move or that he has some like obvious huge flaw, but that he can't go to the universal this quickly. Yeah, lots of Platonists I think would be relieved by that fact.
Anthony.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Thank you. That was lovely. I don't know. This is not really a terribly serious question, but I'm just so much reminded of the philosophy of mind conversation about panpsychism, that stuff. So we think, this natural sciences tell us about the relations of things, and they don't tell us about their intrinsic natures. And then what happens in that conversation is you get this kind of bizarre, something studies the intrinsic characteristics of matter. What is it? It's consciousness. And that's just so anyway, I wondered if you had something there.
I like the analogy. I think that's right. I like it and I don't like it because it makes my move feel weaker. Because I think that's a kind of that's a little bit of a concessive move in its original context. But having said that, its original context is that's not water I swim in. I don't have any expertise to weigh in on those issues. I think so. One of the reasons I like to hope that there's some strength to the move I'm making is that like I really do think I think there's so everyone should in some sense agree that metaphysicians are studying abstractness as a property, as a quality, right? There's no risk of that claim being called question begging here, or at least I hope there's no risk of that claim being called question begging. And if it is question begging, then I suppose you'd have to say like that, and that's the worry in the original context. I see the worry being like, well, that's a question begging move, and I don't agree that consciousness is studying those things. So in this case, in order to say that it's question begging to assume that metaphysics studies abstractness, you'd have to say maybe something like metaphysics thinks it's studying abstractness, but it's not. Right? So metaphysicians are just kind of wrong about what they do. And that actually wouldn't be too surprising. They might be, but that's sort of the way it would have to go, I think. Like otherwise, it just seems. Anyway, I hope I would just be repeating myself if I said more. But thanks for the analogy. It's interesting to think about. Do you have more thoughts about it in its original context that I'm missing because I'm not familiar with the area?
Not serious ones, but something along the lines of, I mean, this actually is very much to echo some things you said earlier, that the relational intrinsic distinction is suspect. And it looked as if it was suspect in the philosophy of mind, and it looks as if it's suspect in the conversations about dispositions. So it may be that, I don't know. My gut says there ought to be some way of reconceptualizing the issue there so that this problem goes away.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see. That would be nice.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I don't
that
have
would be
anything
nice.
better than that.
And I don't have anything. I don't have anything wiser than that to add. It's a cool thought. Um,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, sure.
Okay, I think I've got a short question about the numbers themselves. So I was just wondering if there is any analogy between your kind of approach to numbers and what Lewis calls magical ersatism, where worlds are kind of weird symbols. We don't know whether they, have structure or not. We don't know how they do the stuff, but they do that, by magic. And if something similar is not going on actually here, when we talk about, relational properties, sparse properties, we probably don't know. They do some work. We don't exactly know how they do it, but probably doesn't matter so much. So is there any kind of way of thinking in this way?
Maybe. And that's making me think maybe we ought to be structuralists about the world. Um, and because I think that, what's really nice or really neat about structuralism to me is it helps me get over the feeling that there's a weirdness to the objects, right? Because I know what a structure is. I know what um uh, I feel like I know what the structure of the integers is. Like I feel comfortable with that. It doesn't feel weird to me. Um, and so if you say like, oh, but it's got the numbers in it and they have these kind of magical properties, I'm like, no, there's no magic. That's structure. There's nothing over and above structure going on here, and all of the structure stuff is very comprehensible to me and makes a lot of sense. Um, with magical ersatism, that we're already primed in terms of how to think about that by the label. But if we could sort of ditch the label for a second and say structuralist ersatism or something like that, I'd feel a lot less bothered by it, actually. I'd be like, maybe that is a nice view. Um, and I like, I, I think uh, it's fairly uncontroversial that we need something that can do the role, that can play the role that possible worlds play. And then like there's almost no consensus. After that, all bets are off, right? In terms of what are we going to look for. But if you told me what we're going to go and look for is some structures, I'd be like, yeah, good. Okay, let's go. So I kind of see, I hope this is, not sort of unfairly interpreting what you're saying, but I see this as not a worry about mathematical structuralism, but maybe a positive contribution to magical ersatz. I don't know whether it would work because I mean all the devil is in the details of trying to cash out what those structures would have to be in order to play the role, and whether it is fair to say that all there is to them is structure. That I'm a lot less sure about. Like with mathematical structures, that feels really fair to me. Like metaphysically, that's all there is. With the worlds, I don't know. I feel the force of some of, like, let's say, Lewis's intuitions that there has to be a bit more metaphysically to the worlds than that. But I don't have a horse in the race of what that is. So if someone tried to convince me it was structure, I'd be down to listen to that view. Yeah. Did I interpret your
Yes.
thought correctly, or is that a fair kind of response?
Yes, it is. Yes, thank you. Right, so we have Daniel again.
Great. I've got two questions, but I'll ask only one of them. So the Builes paper to me has a very strange structure because it's like, so you might find Platonism tempting, and okay, I'm tempted to be a Platonist. I think there's something you add to 7 to get 12, and it's not a ball of space time, and it's not a cat, and So, okay, great, they're abstract numbers. Then structuralism's an appealing way to understand what mathematical objects are, and I'm like, okay, well, now I'm a Platonist, and maybe being a structuralist Platonist is the way to go. And then the paper comes along and says, well, I've got an objection to structuralist Platonism, so you have to give up being a Platonist. And I was like, well, no, if there was a good objection to structuralist Platonism on metaphysical grounds, I'd retreat back to non-structuralist. I'd become an anti-structuralist Platonist. Um, my impression is that there isn't much said, but I'm wondering if you can put on your Builes defender hat. Is it that the case for structuralism given Platonism so overwhelming that you'd go all the way back to nominalism if you couldn't be a Platonist, or is it just we go down the garden path and there's reductio, so we drop Platonism?
Yeah, good. So I think channeling Builes and also myself, because I think he and I may agree on this. If you're not a structuralist Platonist, then there is weirdness that you still need to explain. Like, if you want to be a Platonist, structuralism is your best bet. If he's taken out your best bet, then maybe you should review those reasons not to be a Platonist, right? Something like that. And I kind of, I probably wouldn't actually stop being a Platonist, but I would review my reasons. Like, I think I agree with him about this. The weirdness is exactly where you say it is, though, that he doesn't consider this option, and he should. It's also, this is symptomatic of this, is that claim he makes as the first horn of the dilemma, that you have to reject all forms of structuralism in a very extreme way, and you don't, right? So you also don't have to reject all the other kinds of Platonism that you could adopt. And so yeah. Yeah, I think he thinks structuralism was your best bet for avoiding spookiness, and it won't work because you still got spookiness.
Right. Okay. And I think we're on the same page about how spooky it is, but especially vanilla Platonism, it kind of looks like numbers intrinsic, right? There are these different kinds of abstract objects, there are numbers and groups and so on. And then the structuralist comes along and says, well, maybe it's not intrinsic. And I'm like, cool, that looks even more tempting. And then somebody comes along and says, well, that door's shut. I'm like, oh, well,
okay, I'll go back to.
I'd better give up thinking that numbers are special. It's like, why? I mean, they're not cats and dogs, and they can add to 7 to get 12. That's pretty amazing. I mean, if a relational story about that worked, that would be cool. But if it doesn't, walking back,
good.
It's like if I got convinced that the atomic theory of matter was false, I would give up believing that there were coffee cups. It's like,
yeah.
No, I mean, I do think that if there are coffee cups, there are chemical atoms that make them up and physical atoms that make them up. But
now we need a better theory.
Why go all the way back to the start when?
Yeah, good. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that, and I think he just doesn't consider it, and he should. And like I suspect the reason he doesn't consider it is because like he's clearly someone who's motivated by the spookiness of abstract things, including or maybe just particularly abstract mathematical things. So he's so motivated to think they're spooky. Maybe the point is meant to be structuralism is the only way I could consider them as non-spooky. And yeah, you've got no chance of despookifying these things other than structuralism. And that, like, and maybe, part of the reason I've kind of let him off this particular hook is because I kind of feel that way too. Like, I think, structuralism really is your best bet for despookifying. But he ought to say that, right? Because it's another claim that all the non-structuralist Platonists will probably have something to say about. And yes, it makes the argumentative. So I mean, honestly, the argumentative structure is a little weird and hard to follow at a few points. Like I'm never entirely so like when you take his two premise argument, the claim is necessarily there are no abstract mathematical objects, right? And then by the end, you've got this kind of weird dilemma as the supposed structure of the argument in the paper, which is really actually a dilemma that's supposed to happen if you reject premise two, but seems to be presented as the whole thing we have learned here. So I don't quite know how most charitably to put the dialectical moves of together there. Certainly, I think I don't think his argument for the stated conclusion of the argument, the premise argument, I don't think that conclusion can follow from those premises, even granting like quite a lot to the premises. But if we get into the weeds and we get to the point of saying, like, okay, maybe structuralism's got this problem, then yes, like really we should consider various retreat options other than, okay, cool, nominalism then. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, I think. Okay, Daniel, do you have more questions? Oh,
I do have one more. I don't want to.
okay, please go ahead.
I'll take as many as there are.
Yeah, so this is, I think you mentioned this about the nodes that we could treat them as universals. But of course, there's both structuralist and non-structuralist views that say that mathematical ontology are at the levels of properties and relations already. And I'm not quite sure what the particular universal distinction is supposed to be, but some people think it's incredibly
Yeah.
important. And so I guess I was thinking that if you can get out of his argument by saying, well, the abstract mathematicalia I believe in are universal. And so, of course, they're not bare particulars. They're not even particulars.
Right.
So people like Bigelow have kind of been holding on to that piece of Platonist space for years, and it kind of feels, yeah, both structuralist versions and non-structuralist versions of that. But if his objection isn't to the bare particulars, it's just bareness, right? That nothing's allowed to, for some metaphysical reason, nothing can fail to have a sparse intrinsic property, then they're not off the hook, but then his position is way less plausible because a lot of people don't think I've got to find the sparse properties for the particulars, and then I've got to find the sparse properties for them, and then the sparse properties for them, and then the sparse, right?
Yeah, good.
I'm not saying you couldn't have an infinite regress of sparse properties, but the people who go in for sparse properties usually want to stop at a few levels up. So
Right.
either the particular's doing a lot of work there, in which case there's an easy out for the Platonist, including the structuralist Platonist, or it's not doing any work, and then the principle looks weird. It's like, why should my sparse properties of sparse properties of sparse properties all have sparse properties?
Have sparse properties. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
So I think this is helpful to you, but yeah.
It is, yeah. Thanks. It's a cool point too. And not only, would that claim be weird, it would certainly not be. It's not something he could wheel out and say it has support independently, just from the metaphysical landscape. Because I don't think I've heard anyone try to sort of make a claim like this before. So one thing, I mean. Maybe he's going to say, okay, my conclusion was about abstract mathematical objects. Universals are not objects unless they're particulars. Maybe that's it. If you are willing to say that a universal is a kind of object, then maybe he's going to say the bareness considerations will kick in some way. The problem I think is going to be he's going to have a tough time saying that they don't have any sparse. These universals don't have any sparse properties because I could think of a few, like being abstract, for example, and look, unless the same kind of worries are going to infect at that level as well. It won't be if it ends up going in that direction, it won't be quite as much of an easy out, but it's still another out. And I think like the most important thing about it for me is that it would really sweep out the rug from underneath the motivation, which is supposed like he's really laying some weight on the fact that this is motivation from elsewhere in metaphysics. And I don't think bare universals are a thing. Like I don't know, but I haven't heard the phrase bare universals before. And if I were to hear it, actually, the first thing I would have assumed is not that it's a universal that has no sparse properties, but that it's the kind of universal that is the universal of a bare property. But that would not be able to be what he means, I think. Or maybe it would. Now I'm kind of now I'm wondering if he would need a kind of argument that says you can't be a universal of fiveness because fiveness would be a bare property and we can't have any of those. But then that's a way worse argument than no bare property. Like way fewer people are anti-bare properties. Like I haven't heard an argument like that before. Okay, anyway, so either reading of what a bare universal would be, he'd have a lot of work to do. Yeah, that's a cool point. Thank you. Yeah, I mean it's another symptom of this general issue, which is focusing on one particular kind of structuralist Platonism to the exclusion of all the other ways of being a non-nominalist in the space.
Right. Okay, I think we're getting to the end. So unless there is no more question, no more comments. So let me join and thank Carrie again for a fantastic talk.
Thank you all so much. This is super helpful. Really appreciate it. Thanks again for hosting.